Thank you very much for coming along. I've got some PowerPoint slides which are over here, so you might not see them up there, but I'll do my best to describe what's on them. As Alex mentioned, I'm a music historian at the University of York, and I work on the 19th and early 20th century history of music on missions of East and Southern Africa. So on that map there, there's the southern part, Sub-Saharan Africa, and I basically go from just below where it says Durban up to Zanzibar. And those red dots are all sites of mission stations that were established in the 19th century. But today I'm concentrating on the southern portion of that region, and I'm going to be using a selection of papers from the United Society of the Propagation of the Gospel archive, or USPG as it's known for short. And that's a major missionary collection that lives here in the Bodleian. The USPG was founded in 1701 as the SPG, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, and it was a missionary agency, an overseas missionary agency of the Church of England. It's really nice to be doing this talk here, because it's the first time I think I've done a talk about this with the stuff in the flesh, and it's especially nice to do it in Bodleian, and it's also an opportunity to thank and acknowledge Lucy and her team who look after this very important collection and make it available for researchers. And for their work, I'm very grateful. They've done a lot of fetching and refetching and answering questions over the years. I've chosen 4 things to share with you, and they come from the E-series of the USPG archives. The E-series contains reports that missionaries were required to send back to Britain about their work. And they come from, the whole of the E-series comes from all over the world. They're arranged by diocese, that is an ecclesiastical territory overseen by bishop and year. And the 4 things that I've chosen and I'll set out here are from the late 1850s and stretch of the 1860s, and they were sent from the Diocese of Grahamstown in what was then known as the Cape Colony. And it's shown here on this map on the right-hand side, which shows the modern-day South African province of the Eastern Cape, which the Diocese of Grahamstown covered. What I would say at the start is that archives, any archive, exists in a context, and so at the outset I must point out that these 4 records, like many in the USPG archives, come out of a colonial moment. They are also products of a particular time, and so the language, terminology and views often found in them can make for uncomfortable and difficult reading. As you may or may not already know, this period of history in the Eastern Cape came at the tail end of a century of colonialism in the form of very gruesome conflict and tremendously disruptive social upheaval. Missions were, to varying degrees, part of that, and these documents bear the marks of that context, and we need to keep that in our minds as we look at them. My background or introduction to this history came about 17 years ago when I visited St Matthew's, Kaiskammerhoek, and that's marked on that map, circled in red, right in the middle of the Eastern Cape. And here it is, 17-year-old photographs, but the place pretty much still looks like that. And I made this visit to St Matthew's, Kaiskammerhoek, which is in a very rural part of the Eastern Cape. St Matthew's was founded in 1854 with financial support from the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. So the missionaries who worked there were required to write their reports back, and they became part of the E-series. And on that visit to St Matthew's, I was most struck by the singing that I heard. And it became clear to me that there was a history to look into. And because I couldn't really find very much on the music history of St Matthew's and missions like it, I thought it would be a good idea to start digging around. And that's what brought me to the USPG archive. I must admit that it was a gamble, as I really didn't know if I would find anything. And so I was very relieved when, having made a trip to Oxford, that within a few pages of the first volume I called up, there was a report in which someone was talking about music. It was a report very much like this one. You wouldn't expect to find music on a page like that, but they are full of them. And so I continued paging through what I found, and time again, what I found was that missionaries were talking about music. They were talking about what was being sung, they were talking about who was singing, they were talking about the hymns that they were translating, they were talking about what music worked, they were talking about what instruments they were using, they were talking about what didn't work and what they didn't want to hear, and they were talking about how music happened, by, for example, using a printing press, and I brought a prop along with me. So to illustrate these points that I've just made about the missionary archive, let's start by looking at this one here. I'm going to talk about this one in a bit more detail and then invite you to come and look at the others, and I'll tell you a bit about them. This is from the E series E.13, and it's dated 1862. And it was written at St Matthew's, Kaiskammerhoek. That's a contemporary image of the place. St Matthew's was established in 1854, and it was at the centre of an area in the Eastern Cape that at the time was inhabited by Amamfengu. And Amamfengu are one of the isiXhosa-speaking groups of people in the Eastern Cape. And they had been settled around there by the British governor of the region, and the Amamfengu were largely unconverted to Christianity, and that was the missionaries' job, was to go and convert them. So this report is dated 1862, and it's written by a missionary called William Greenstock. And he was in charge of St Matthew's at the time. And he writes, here it is in modern handwriting, Mr. Tabor has paid particular attention to the singing, and considering that he commenced in July last to teach them the tonic sulfur system, the progress has been remarkable. The scholars gave a concert on December 17th. They performed a number of pieces, 8 sacred and 15 secular, without a single hitch. Now, Mr. Tabor referred to there was William Greenstock's junior. Tabor was originally from Nuneaton, and he'd recently arrived in South Africa to start his work as a missionary. This one document, I think, epitomizes what makes these missionary records so interesting from a musical point of view, because they can help us to understand the actual act of music making and its significance, and how music was used to represent the mission world. There's a lot to unpack just here, but I'm going to highlight 4 things. And the first is the tonic sulfur aspect of it. Can anyone recognize this tune? This is a hymn which is written in 4-part harmony. So the top line from the bracket is the soprano line, there's the alto, there's the tenor, and the bass. So it's the 4 parts, and the melody is the top line. Tonic sulfur, which is what this is notated in, was a popular method for teaching musical literacy in 19th century Britain, and it was used by missionaries overseas. And you find missionaries all over the world saying that they're using tonic sulfur. Basically, it's do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So you've got do, ti, la, so, do. I'll leave that up for a bit, and if anyone can identify the tune, come and tell me, and I'll buy you a drink or something like that. So on missions, there were practical reasons for using tonic sulfur. Firstly, it utilized the letters of the alphabet, so it reinforced alphabetical literacy, which is what the missionaries were trying to teach. And it was also very easy to print. Staff notation would have been very expensive, it would have been very specialized, whereas missionaries had all of the type that they needed to set something like this. The second point that I want to make is how missionaries used music to represent what they were doing and to talk about what they were doing. And that was very often as a measurement of success, as we see here. This concert was remarkable because of the speed with which the scholars had learnt to read tonic sulfur and then use it in a concert. And so music was showing that Tabor and Greenstock were getting on with their work and getting their work done. And this was important because these reports were being written to patrons and donors of overseas mission work. And so it was very important to be able to highlight these positive things. And music, time and time again, comes through as one of those positive reinforcement things of the work they were doing. The third thing that I want to point out about this particular one is that documents like this are full of both sound and silence. Looking at this particular one, yes, it's on the screen, sorry, it's in front of me. Looking at this particular one, if you go down to the bottom of the first paragraph, this is written by our friend William Greenstock again. He talks about the sound of the language. He says that he pronounced the name of the river near our mission station as the Inika River. It's very, very different sounds, which had to be imagined by the readers. And he carries on to say that in that river, all around the year, there's a nightly concert of frogs. There's a lot of sound jumping out of the page at you in these sources. But there's also a lot of silence, and that's something that I find quite poignant and something that I try to theorize about. And the other form of silence that comes out of these documents is not just that they are silent documents in and of themselves, but it's that coexistence of sound and silence which produces a tension that leads to my fourth point. And that is that by far the greater portion of these reports in the E series are written by white British male missionaries. And even in the case of exceptions to that, and there are exceptions of which one is on display here, you only really get a one-sided view of what the missionaries think and what they're saying about these musical narratives. Yet, as this report here about the concert shows us, these are heteroglossic texts. There are many voices embedded in them, in addition to the authorial dominant missionary voice. And so we need to consider these documents and ask questions such as, what did the Amamfengu scholars think of the concert? What was their response to being taught tonic solfa? How did they view the styles of music that were being introduced by Tabor and Greenstock? These are very difficult things to answer because we don't have sources to give us those answers, but they're important things to consider and theorize about. As I said earlier, this document and these other ones and many others like it were generated in the colonial moment, and as such they reflect the imbalances of power which resulted in the silencing or omission of certain voices. And whether this was deliberate or not, and I think it's different at different times as to whether missionaries were deliberately silencing and whether there was intention behind it. It's up to us as people working with these archives to ask these questions about the other people involved in these stories. I'm just going to whiz across here quickly talking about these different documents, and then do come and you can then try your hand at reading missionary handwriting and come and look at them. This one here, again written by William Greenstock. So he crops up over and over again. He was quite a musical missionary, he came from Somerset, and he learnt tonic solfa in Mells in Somerset, and was then educated at Marks College in Chelsea, which trained teachers. He went and taught for a few years before deciding he was going to become a missionary. And this report was written when he was still quite green in the mission field, as it were, and he is writing from St Matthew's Kais Kamahuk, which is where that one was written as well. And one evening he hears a dance going on at an Amamfengu homestead nearby, and he gets very uppity about this dance. He tries to interfere to stop it. He goes in and talks to the people. He describes a bit of what the music sounded like. But then it leads to this very interesting moment of introspection where he goes away and he writes this in the report. He says, I actually don't really know what this dance was about. I'm going to try and find out. And he works out that it's something religious and it's something to do with the harvest. And he goes away and he has to completely change his sermon for the next Sunday and totally flip around the liturgical season that he was following, because he suddenly had to preach about harvest in February, whereas he was used to keeping harvest in October and November. And I think it's an interesting moment which shows how the Amamfengu, who were the indigenous people of the area, how they were having an influence on the missionary. And he was very incensed by what they were doing, but he realized that if he was going to get them on board, he had to change his strategy a little bit. So going back to that idea of the voices and how they impact on these narratives that we read about. This one here is 1869, and it's written from, I'll just go back to this map. It's written from a place called Sojana, which is near St Mark's. If you go up from St Matthew's and roughly to about 1 o'clock, there's a place called St Mark's Mark there. And St Mark's was a mission founded about the same time as St Matthew's, and unlike St Matthew's, it was in an independent part of Bodleian, so that bit was not under British control. And the whole idea was that the Anglicans wanted to establish something in independent Bodleian so that they could exert their influence in there. And this report is written by a man called Peter Masiza, who was an Mfengu. He was educated by Moravian missionaries and then converted to Anglicanism and educated at St Matthew's Kais Kamahuk. And then he went on to have a career as a missionary. He was the first African black man to be ordained as an Anglican priest in the South African church. And he wrote this report on a visit to an outstation, and he talks about being in a service and starting to sing a hymn, and the congregation starts laughing at him. Presumably because this genre of the hymn, the style of the hymn, was unknown to them. And I think it's an interesting moment because it highlights the role that indigenous proselytizers and evangelists had in missionary work. and that very difficult position that someone like Caesar would have occupied as an adherent of this new Christianity, and having to preach to his kinsfolk who were not converted to Christianity, and that sort of that difficulty and that difficult space that he would have occupied. And then the last one over here is written by a missionary called Henry Waters, who was the head missionary at St. Mark's, and it is 1859. And in this report, Waters talks about going off to visit an outstation, and he goes to a homestead where a chief called Ngonyama lives, and Ngonyama means lion, that was his chief's name. And he goes to visit the chief, and they have a very good time. According to Waters, it's all very cordial. And at evening, in the evening, when they're sitting down for dinner, a few of the local people bring out some instruments and start playing. And he describes the sound of the instruments that he hears. These were traditional closet instruments that you do still hear played in parts of the Eastern Cape. The one was what he calls Gwali, which I think is actually an hardy, and it's a bow, so it looks like a bow and arrow, and it's got a calabash gourd which you hold to your body, and you beat the string, and you produce overtones by moving the instrument to and from the body like that, and it's sung to. And the other one is an umgwali, which is a flute. It's a really curious moment of appreciation that Waters has for local musical culture, but he stops at that because he would never want to see these instruments incorporated into the music that he wants to see in his mission. But it's also one of the few moments in these archives where you see an instrument drawn. So it's exceptional from that point of view. In fact, it's the only one that I know of. But it's also exceptional from this insight that a missionary gives into an indigenous musical culture. Very often they're like Greenstock, they're trying to stop things, and they prefer not to talk about them at all. So I think that's it really. I invite you to come and have a look and see what you make of them. What I'd say in conclusion is that working with these archives, realization I've come to, or conclusion I've come to, is that music is possibly anything but benign, but an extremely powerful vehicle of expression. And that's why it's been central to the practice of the Christian Church for thousands of years, and why these missionaries thought that it was so important. We've seen how, for missionaries, music was a measure of success. It was how ideas and language were taught and reinforced and imparted. It was also a means of resistance, but that's another topic for another day and for longer than 10 minutes. But to go back to beginning, I've lost it now. Anyway, that picture, there it is. That picture of St. Matthew's. To go back to St. Matthew's in 2008, I think the realization that I came to then is that this music is still there, and it continues, and it's got a very living history that continues to reflect what goes on in places such as St. Matthew's. That's it, thank you. Please do come in.